Picture a Japan where the age of open war is finally, mercifully ending. The great battles are over, the smoke has cleared, and a new order is being imposed on a land exhausted by a century of bloodshed. It is in this fragile, transitional world that a boy is born who will become something far beyond a soldier. He will become a legend so vast and so strange that even today, in dojos and boardrooms and philosophy classes around the world, his name is spoken with reverence. This is the story of Miyamoto Musashi, the greatest swordsman who ever lived, a man who fought over 60 duels and never once lost, a warrior who walked away from every single one of them. But Musashi's story is not simply about violence. It is about the long, lonely, relentless pursuit of perfection. It is about a man who spent his entire life trying to understand, at the deepest possible level, what it truly means to master something. Tonight, we will follow Musashi from his violent and troubled beginnings to his final years of stillness and reflection. We will walk with him through fog-covered forests and onto the decks of boats at dawn. We will sit beside him as he writes, by candlelight, one of the most profound books on strategy ever conceived. But before we begin that journey, I would love to know where you are right now and what time of night it is where you are. Tell me in the comments below. And if this kind of story speaks to you, please do consider subscribing to the channel. It means so much. Now settle in and let the world outside go quiet for a while. What makes Musashi so enduringly fascinating is not simply that he was extraordinarily skilled. History is full of extraordinarily skilled people who are now forgotten. What makes him singular is that he refused to stop at skill. He kept pushing, kept asking, kept disassembling and rebuilding his understanding of what he was doing and why, right up until the last weeks of his life. He was a man who treated his own existence as a kind of ongoing experiment, a long, patient investigation into the nature of mastery itself. And the conclusions he arrived at, written in a cave by a dying man, are still being debated and applied and argued over nearly 4 centuries later. That is an extraordinary achievement. That is a life that found its meaning and transmitted it forward through time. Tonight, we will try to understand how he got there. The exact details of Musashi's birth have always been a matter of some debate, and that uncertainty itself feels fitting for a man whose life would be defined by mystery and contradiction. Most historians place his birth around the year 1584 in the province of Mimasaka, in what is now the Okayama prefecture of Japan. He was born into a world that was trembling on the edge of a transformation. The Sengoku period, the era of the warring states, was drawing to an agonizing close after more than a century of near-constant civil war. His father, Shinmen Munisai, was a celebrated martial artist in his own right, a man renowned for his skill with a yuta, a specialized iron truncheon, and with the sword. Munisai held an official rank from the Ashikaga shogunate, which was a mark of genuine distinction in that era. But despite his accomplishments, Munisai was a difficult and turbulent man. The relationship between father and son was damaged early and irreparably. Some accounts suggest Musashi's mother died when he was very young, and that his father either abandoned him entirely or was so brutal in his treatment of the boy that a formal separation became necessary. Musashi was raised primarily by an uncle who was a Buddhist monk, a man who gave the boy a rudimentary education and grounding in the spiritual disciplines that would later come to define his character. But the boy was restless, physically powerful, and drawn to conflict from an extraordinarily early age. Even as a child, there was something in him that seemed to push against every boundary placed around him. He was not, by any account, an easy child to raise or to love. He was wild in a way that suggested something was already being forged inside him, something hard and sharp and completely his own. There is a moment in Musashi's life so startling, so almost incomprehensible, that it forces you to stop and truly reckon with the world he inhabited. He was 13 years old when he fought and killed his first man. Not in a war, not in a battle, in a formal duel, one-on-one, in a field, against a grown adult warrior who had specifically come looking for a fight. The man's name was Arima Kihei. He was a traveling martial artist, a practitioner of the Shinto-ryu school of swordsmanship, and he had arrived in Musashi's region with the intention of posting a public challenge. In the culture of feudal Japan, such public challenges were a recognized institution. A skilled warrior would announce himself, invite all comers to test their abilities against him, and whoever accepted was bound by the rules of the duel. It was a way of building a reputation, of proving one's school was superior to all others. Young Musashi, not yet 14 years old, responded to the challenge. The details of what followed vary slightly depending on the source, but the essential truth is consistent across all of them. The boy attacked with ferocious, almost reckless aggression. When Arima drew his sword, Musashi apparently used a simple wooden staff to beat him to the ground, and then, while the man lay stunned, beat him to death. It was brutal, unpolished, and completely effective. In later life, Musashi would acknowledge this first duel not with pride, but with a kind of puzzled wonder. He did not yet understand why he had won. He simply had, and that absence of understanding would drive him forward for the rest of his life. The year 1600 was one of the most consequential in Japanese history. The great lords of the land had divided into two vast coalitions, and the question of who would rule Japan was to be settled in a single catastrophic battle. The Battle of Sekigahara, fought in October of that year on a misty plain in the mountains of central Japan, would involve over 150,000 men and would last, in its most intense phase, only a single day. It was one of the largest battles ever fought on Japanese soil, and its outcome would determine the shape of the country for the next 2.5 centuries. Musashi, now around 16 years old, chose to fight. He aligned himself with the Western Coalition, the forces loyal to the Toyotomi clan, the family that had held power before the rise of Tokugawa Ieyasu. It was the losing side. The eastern forces of Tokugawa crushed the Western Coalition decisively, and the survivors scattered in every direction. What exactly Musashi experienced during and after the battle is not entirely clear from the historical record, but we know he survived where countless others did not. The battlefield afterward was a charnel house of unimaginable proportions, and walking away from it alive was itself an achievement. The consequences of having fought on the wrong side were significant and lasting. The new Tokugawa order that was now consolidating its grip on Japan would go on to become one of the most rigid and hierarchical governments in the world. The samurai class was being slowly transformed from warriors into bureaucrats and administrators. For a man of Musashi's temperament, a man who had no patience for hierarchy, ceremony, or submission to authority, this new world was going to be deeply uncomfortable. He would spend the next several years wandering, fighting, and searching for something he could not yet name. What Musashi embarked on after Sekigahara has a specific name in Japanese culture. It is called Mushashugyo, which translates roughly as austere warrior training or the warrior's pilgrimage. It was a recognized practice among serious martial artists of the era. A young warrior would leave his home, take to the road with almost nothing, and travel the country seeking out skilled opponents. The goal was not fame. It was not money. It was the sharpening of the self through constant adversity and combat. Musashi threw himself into this life with a totality that was extreme even by the standards of his time. He slept rough, often in forests or temples. He ate whatever he could find or beg. He bathed infrequently. He deliberately stripped away every comfort and every distraction in the belief that ease and luxury dulled the spirit just as surely as rust dulls a blade. He would later write about this period of his life in terms that make it sound almost monastic, a long, deliberate purification through hardship and solitude. During these years of wandering, Musashi fought and won a remarkable series of duels. He kept no precise count, but the chronicles that accumulated around him over the years record more than 60 individual contests, and in none of them did he suffer defeat. Some of these opponents were inexperienced fighters who posed little real danger, but others were acknowledged masters, men with decades of experience and established schools behind them, men who had never been beaten and who saw in the young vagabond an opportunity to add another name to their lists of victories. They were wrong about that. Every single one of them was wrong about that. Of all the duels in Musashi's extraordinary career, none was more dramatic or carried more consequences than his series of encounters with the Yoshioka school of swordsmanship in Kyoto. The Yoshioka family had been official sword instructors to the Ashikaga shogunate, and they carried with them all the prestige and institutional weight that such a position implies. To challenge them was not merely to challenge skilled fighters. It was to challenge the establishment itself. It was a declaration of war against the old order of martial arts authority. Musashi arrived in Kyoto as a young man, perhaps around 21 years old, deliberately seeking out the Yoshioka school. He challenged the head of the school, Yoshioka Seijuro, to a duel. This was an almost unthinkable act of audacity. Seijuro was a recognized master, a man of aristocratic bearing and considerable reputation. He accepted the challenge, perhaps dismissing the young wanderer as a minor nuisance to be dealt with quickly. They agreed to meet at a set place and time. When the hour came, Musashi arrived late, deliberately late. Some accounts say he was an hour behind, others say it was much longer. The purpose of this calculated tardiness was psychological. He wanted Seijuro waiting, stewing in anticipation and irritation, his composure already disturbed before a single blow was struck. When Musashi finally appeared, the fight was swift and decisive. He struck Seijuro once, breaking the man's shoulder and leaving him unable to continue. Seijuro retired from the martial arts after his injury, which was itself a humiliation without precedent for a school of that standing. The Yoshioka clan, furious at this disgrace, sent the next brother, Denshichiro, to avenge the family honor. Musashi defeated him as well, killing him outright this time. What followed was extraordinary. The Yoshioka school collectively declared vengeance. They gathered their remaining students, reportedly including young men and boys from the school. and arranged a final confrontation. They set an ambush for Musashi in the darkness before dawn, intending to overwhelm him with sheer numbers. Musashi arrived first. He killed the school's young acting head before the trap could be fully sprung, and then fought his way clear of the remaining attackers. When the chaos was over, the Yoshioka school, as a functioning institution, was effectively finished. It never recovered its former standing. The Yoshioka episode reveals something essential about the way Musashi approached conflict that goes beyond mere physical courage. He understood that the psychology of the encounter began long before the first blow was struck. By challenging the most prestigious school in Kyoto, by deliberately arriving late, by refusing to treat these engagements with the formal solemnity that his opponents expected, he was systematically dismantling the mental architecture that his opponents relied on to perform at their best. He was not just fighting men. He was fighting institutions, reputations, the accumulated weight of tradition and expectation. And he was doing it with the same quality of analytical clarity that he brought to the physical dimensions of combat. Every decision, the timing of his arrival, the choice of when to kill and when to wound, the calculation of when to stand and fight and when to withdraw, reflected a mind that was processing the full complexity of the situation rather than simply reacting to its most immediate demands. Sometime during his years of wandering and fighting, Musashi developed the technique for which he is perhaps most visually famous. He began fighting with two swords simultaneously. In Japanese martial arts, this style is called Nito-ryu, or the two-sword style, and it was so unusual, so contrary to the established understanding of how a sword should be wielded, that it marked Musashi as a genuine innovator rather than simply an exceptionally skilled practitioner of existing methods. The conventional wisdom of the time held that the long sword, the katana, required two hands to be used effectively. The power of a sword cut, it was believed, came from the grip of both hands working together, from the rotation of the body, from the use of the whole physical frame as a unified instrument of force. To use only one hand was to weaken the cut. To hold a weapon in the other hand was, in the received understanding of every school, a distraction and a liability. Musashi disagreed with all of this, and he disagreed not with words, but with results. His two-sword style was not about fighting with equal weapons in each hand. It was something more subtle and strategic than that. The shorter sword, the wakizashi, was used to create openings, to control distance, to occupy the opponent's attention and force them to defend against unexpected angles. The long sword then struck through the gaps created by this confusion. It was a fundamentally different philosophy of combat, one that treated the engagement as a puzzle to be solved through creativity rather than a contest of pure physical power. This was already, in embryonic form, the beginning of the strategic thinking that would eventually find full expression in his written work. If there is one moment in Musashi's life that the world remembers above all others, it is the duel with Sasaki Kojiro on the tiny island of Ganryujima in the spring of 1612. It is a story so perfectly constructed, so rich in symbolism and drama, that it reads almost like myth, and yet the essential historical facts of what happened that morning are well attested. It was not just a fight between two men. It was a confrontation between two completely opposed philosophies of martial excellence. Sasaki Kojiro was, in many respects, everything Musashi was not. Where Musashi was rough, unkempt, and deliberately anti-establishment, Kojiro was refined, elegant, and celebrated by polite society. His technique was exquisite, centered on a devastatingly powerful strike called the Tsubame Gaishi, the swallow counter, named for the swift reversal of a swallow's tail in flight. He fought with an unusually long sword, a weapon so long that it had earned the nickname Monohoshi Zao, the drying pole. He was acknowledged by contemporaries as one of the finest swordsmen alive. To those who followed such matters, a meeting between Musashi and Kojiro was the most anticipated martial encounter of the age. The duel had been formally arranged under the sponsorship of the Hosokawa clan, a powerful feudal domain. The location was the small island of Ganryujima in the Kanman Strait. Both men were to arrive at the appointed time. Once again, Musashi was late, but this time the lateness was extreme. He was hours behind the agreed time. Kojiro waited on the beach, his composure eroding with every passing minute. The lord hosting the event sent messengers. By the time Musashi finally arrived, traveling across the water in a small boat he had kept waiting, Kojiro had been standing on that beach for a very long time, stewing in a fury that had replaced whatever equanimity he might have brought to the encounter. Musashi stepped out of the boat with a wooden sword he had been carving from an oar during the crossing. He had deliberately brought no real blade. Some accounts say he had slept during the boat ride, resting peacefully while Kojiro raged on the shore. When Kojiro saw him, the man reportedly cried out in fury and drew his long sword, flinging the scabbard into the sea. Musashi, seeing this, said something that has been endlessly interpreted and debated ever since. He told Kojiro that a man who throws away his scabbard has already decided he will not survive the fight. Whether those were his exact words or a later embellishment does not really matter. The psychological reading is acute. Kojiro had let his emotions take control. He had already lost. The actual exchange was nearly instantaneous. Kojiro struck first with his famous swallow counter technique. Musashi stepped in and brought the wooden sword down in a single decisive blow to the head. Kojiro fell. Some accounts say Musashi's headband, sliced by the tip of Kojiro's blade in that blurring final moment, drifted to the ground beside the fallen man, showing just how narrow the margin had been. Musashi stood over his opponent for a moment, then bowed, turned, and walked back to his boat. He left the island without a word. He was 29 years old, and he would never fight a serious duel again. This fact is one of the most intriguing and least discussed aspects of Musashi's legacy. After Ganryujima, after more than 60 duels across roughly 15 years, he simply stopped seeking out opponents. The man who had defined himself entirely through combat, who had walked into the teeth of ambushes and faced acknowledged masters and survived every single encounter, deliberately turned away from the arena of the duel and began looking for something else. He never fully explained this transition in simple terms, but scattered through his later writings are passages that hint at the nature of his thinking during those years. He began to believe that true mastery could not be found in victory alone. Winning a duel, he seemed to conclude, told you something about your technique and your timing and your spirit in a given moment. But it did not tell you whether you truly understood the deep principles from which technique and timing and spirit all arose. A man could win through luck. A man could win through a superior physical gift. A man could win through knowing his opponent's specific weaknesses. None of these was mastery. Mastery was something rarer, something that could not be definitively demonstrated in the moments before another man fell. There is also something else worth considering. The Japan Musashi had grown up in, the Japan of the Warring States period, was disappearing. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, the country was moving toward a long era of controlled peace, the Edo period, which would last until the middle of the 19th century. The economy of violence that had given men like Musashi a context and a purpose was being deliberately dismantled. The great lords were being pacified. The ronin, the masterless samurai, were becoming an embarrassment to the new order rather than a resource. A man who had built his entire identity on being an undefeatable warrior was going to have to figure out what to do with that identity in a world that no longer had room for the kind of war he had been born into. What Musashi chose to do in the second half of his life is one of the most unexpected turns in the history of any figure of his type. He became an artist. Not as a hobby, not as a casual distraction from the serious work of being a warrior, but as a genuine and deeply committed creative practitioner whose work has been assessed by scholars and curators as possessing real artistic merit on its own terms, entirely apart from the fame of the man who created it. His paintings, executed in the bold, spare style of Zen ink painting called Suiboku-ga, are among the most celebrated examples of their kind. They are remarkable for their economy. A single brush stroke depicting a shrike on a dead branch, a great predatory bird, all coiled potential, perched at the edge of nothing. The images carry a silence and a tension that is entirely consistent with everything we know about Musashi's inner life. They do not labor to impress. They do not fill the space available to them with demonstrating. They occupy precisely the space they need and no more, and then they stop. There is something in that restraint that feels like a direct translation of his martial philosophy into a different medium. He also worked in sculpture, in metalwork, in lacquerwork. He designed garden layouts and studied classical poetry. He approached each of these disciplines with the same methodical seriousness he had brought to swordsmanship, studying the principles of the craft rather than simply imitating the surface appearances of existing masterworks. He was not interested in being a dilettante, in collecting accomplishments as decorations. He was interested in understanding the underlying nature of what it meant to be skilled at something, and he seemed to believe that this understanding was transferable across domains. The hand that knew the sword, when properly directed, could also know the brush. The mind that could read the intervals of a duel could also read the intervals of negative space in a composition. Throughout his later years, Musashi increasingly took on students, and his manner of teaching was as unconventional as everything else about him. He had founded his own school of swordsmanship, which he named Niten Ichi Ryu, meaning two heavens as one, a name that reflects both the two-sword technique and the philosophical aspiration toward a unified understanding of heaven, earth, and the human spirit operating between them. He did not teach in the way that most schools of his era taught. The dominant pedagogical model of Japanese martial arts at the time was highly formal and sequential, built around a series of kata, which are prescribed forms or patterns that the student learns and refines through repetition. There is great value in this approach, and Musashi did not dismiss it entirely. But he believed that over-reliance on fixed forms produced fighters who were technically accomplished but strategically rigid, men who could execute what they had been taught beautifully, but who fell apart when confronted with something genuinely unexpected. His most famous student was a man named Terao Magonojo, and the letters Musashi wrote to Magonojo late in their relationship are among the most intimate and revealing documents we have from Musashi's inner life. In them, Musashi writes about the frustrations of transmitting genuine understanding rather than mere technique. He expresses a kind of philosophical loneliness, the loneliness of a man who has spent decades arriving at a vision of truth and who now finds that the truth itself resists simple articulation. He tells Magonojo to practice constantly, but also to practice thinking, to study the principles of other crafts, to look at how a carpenter uses his tools and understand what that reveals about precision and adaptation and timing. He was trying to teach not a set of skills, but a way of seeing. Before his total withdrawal from public life, Musashi was drawn back into the arena of actual warfare one final time. In 1614 and 1615, the Tokugawa shogunate moved to crush the last significant threat to its rule, the Toyotomi clan, which had retreated to its stronghold of Osaka Castle. The resulting sieges, the Winter Campaign and the Summer Campaign, were among the largest military operations of the era, involving hundreds of thousands of combatants. Musashi joined the Tokugawa forces, a significant reversal from his alignment at Sekigahara 14 years earlier. It may have reflected a pragmatic recognition of which way history was moving. It may also have reflected a genuine change in allegiance, though Musashi was never a man who wore his political convictions on his sleeve. What we know is that he participated in the fighting, that he survived it, and that the experience of large-scale warfare, so different in character from the intimate mathematics of a single duel, seems to have deepened rather than contradicted his emerging philosophical framework. The fall of Osaka Castle and the death of the last Toyotomi heir effectively ended the era of contested power in Japan. The Tokugawa order was now unchallenged. The country was entering a long period of administered peace under a rigid social hierarchy. For Musashi, watching this transformation unfold from the inside of a military campaign, there must have been something deeply clarifying about it. The world that had produced him was ending. The question of what he was going to do with the rest of his life was no longer abstract. It had become urgent. The decades between the siege of Osaka and Musashi's final retirement to the cave where he would write his masterwork were years of continued movement, continued seeking, and a gradually deepening stillness within the movement. He traveled widely across Japan, visiting temples and monasteries, spending time with scholars and artists and monks. He took on occasional employment with various domain lords, serving sometimes as a military advisor, sometimes as a creative collaborator on large-scale artistic and landscaping projects. He lived for a period in the domain of the Hosokawa clan in Kumamoto, in the far south of the main island of Kyushu. The Hosokawa lords were notable patrons of the arts as well as skilled military commanders, and they seem to have understood what Musashi was becoming in his later years in a way that many others did not. They gave him space and resources and the freedom to pursue his investigations without demanding that he perform the role of the spectacular dueling warrior that his legend required. Under their patronage, he produced some of his finest artwork and began the long process of crystallizing his philosophical ideas into writing. During these years, he also experienced at least one significant and puzzling incident that reveals how strange and unpredictable his path remained, even in his more settled later life. He was involved in a violent episode in the domain of the Ogasawara clan, the details of which are murky and contested, but which apparently involved Musashi publicly humiliating a group of the clan's official sword instructors, demonstrating in a highly embarrassing manner that their technique was fundamentally flawed. It cost him the goodwill of that particular domain and forced him to move on. Even in his most philosophical phase, he could not resist the compulsion to demonstrate truth when he saw falsehood being treated with authority. There is one more violent chapter in Musashi's later life, and it is one of the strangest and most morally complex of all. In 1637 and 1638, the Shimabara rebellion broke out in the Kyushu region, not far from where Musashi was living. It was an uprising of Christian peasants and dispossessed ronin, driven to desperation by crushing taxation, religious persecution, and the systematic dismantling of the old warrior class by the Tokugawa order. The rebellion was eventually suppressed with enormous brutality. Musashi was present in an advisory capacity with the Tokugawa forces besieging the rebel castle of Hara, and during one engagement he apparently rode too close to the castle walls and was struck and injured by stones thrown from the battlements, either from a catapult or by defenders above. He was not seriously hurt, but the incident reportedly left him shaken and, by some accounts, briefly embarrassed. The man who had walked through 60 duels without a scratch had been knocked down by a flying rock while advising a siege. What is more significant than the physical incident, however, is what Shimabara represented. It was a brutal demonstration of the new Japan's willingness to crush anything that threatened its order, including the remnants of the old warrior class who had not found a comfortable place within the Tokugawa system. Musashi was watching the last embers of the world he had come from being stamped out with methodical violence. It seems to have moved him, in the years immediately following, toward an accelerated urgency in his philosophical work. He did not have forever. The ideas gathering in him needed to be written down. In 1643, Miyamoto Musashi climbed into a cave. He was around 60 years old, which was quite an advanced age by the standards of his era. He had been experiencing declining health for some time, possibly related to a neurological condition, and he knew with the kind of clarity that serious illness tends to bring that his time was genuinely limited. He had been given the use of a cave called Reigando, the Spirit Rock Cave, not far from the city of Kumamoto, under the continued patronage of the Hosokawa clan. Over the next 2 years, in that cave, he wrote the Go-Rin no Sho, the Book of 5 Rings. It is one of the most extraordinary texts produced by any martial artist in any culture at any point in history, and it has been read and studied not only by martial artists, but by business strategists, military commanders, philosophers, athletes, and anyone who has ever needed to think clearly and act decisively under conditions of uncertainty and opposition. The book is divided into 5 chapters, each named after one of the classical Japanese elements: earth, water, fire, wind, and void. The Earth chapter establishes the foundations of his philosophy, the principles that everything else rests upon. He begins with a statement that has puzzled and inspired readers for nearly 4 centuries. He says that the way of the warrior is the way of death. But he does not mean this as a celebration of violence. He means it as a statement about freedom from the fear of consequences. A warrior who is afraid to die is a warrior whose judgment is constantly distorted by self-preservation. A warrior who has truly accepted death as a constant companion can think clearly and act without hesitation. This is not nihilism. It is a very specific form of liberation. The water chapter, which is the heart of the technical instruction, uses water as a metaphor for the quality of mind that Musashi believes the ideal swordsman must cultivate. Water takes the shape of whatever contains it. It can be still as a mirror or violent as a torrent. It finds its own level without being told where to go. It is the quality of adaptability carried to its ultimate expression. The fighter who is like water cannot be planned against because they have no fixed shape to plan against. They respond to what is actually present rather than to what they expected to find. The fire chapter addresses the dynamics of combat itself, the management of rhythm and timing and momentum, the ways in which the initiative can be seized and held or lost. He writes about what he calls the 3 initiatives, ways of understanding who is controlling the flow of an encounter and how that control can be shifted. He also discusses the importance of never doing what your opponent expects, of always introducing an element of the unexpected that forces them out of whatever mental preparation they have made. He is describing, in the language of sword fighting, principles of strategic disruption that apply in any competitive domain. The wind chapter is, in some ways, the most fascinating. It is a critique of other schools of swordsmanship, an assessment of where Musashi believed the mainstream martial arts tradition of his era had gone wrong. He is respectful in tone, but utterly unsparing in substance. He objects to the fetishization of technique, to the elevation of style and elegance over effectiveness, to the tendency of established schools to guard their methods as proprietary secrets that gave them commercial advantage rather than sharing the genuine principles that would make their students truly capable. He is describing a failure he sees throughout human institutions, the tendency of people who have something valuable to protect it rather than to transmit it. The final chapter of the Book of 5 Rings is the shortest and also, in its way, the most ambitious. The Void chapter is only a few hundred words long, and in those words, Musashi attempts something that most martial arts writers do not even try. He attempts to describe what genuine mastery actually feels like from the inside, not what it looks like from the outside, not the techniques or the principles, but the lived experience of having truly internalized something so completely that it is no longer separate from you. He describes the void not as emptiness, but as completeness. The void is what remains when you have learned everything that can be learned and practiced everything that can be practiced, and then let go of your attachment to all of it. The master swordsman does not think about where to put his feet, or how to hold his sword, or what technique to apply to a given situation. Those things have been incorporated so deeply into the structure of his nervous system and his perception that they operate without conscious direction. What remains available to consciousness is something cleaner and freer, something that can simply see what is actually happening and respond to it without the interference of habit or ego or fear. This is not a mystical claim, though it uses language that sounds mystical. It is a description of what cognitive scientists and performance psychologists would today recognize as the state of flow, or what athletes sometimes call being in the zone. Musashi was describing this state in 1645 from a cave without any of the scientific vocabulary we would now bring to the description. He was describing it from the inside, from personal experience accumulated over 6 decades of relentless practice, and what he describes matches, with striking precision, what modern researchers have found when they study elite performance in any complex domain. 7 days before he died, Miyamoto Musashi wrote one more document. It is called the Dokodo, which translates as the way of walking alone, or the path of aloneness. It consists of 21 precepts, short declarative statements about how he believed a person should live in order to maintain the kind of inner freedom and clarity that he had spent his whole life pursuing. He gave this document to his most devoted student, Terao Magonojo, as a final gift and final teaching. The precepts of the Dokodo are startling in their austerity and their directness. He instructs the reader not to seek pleasure for its own sake, not to follow a path of ease, not to pursue the pleasures of food or sensory comfort, not to grieve over the things that have been lost, not to be attached to the idea of one's own death, not to be resentful, not to be envious, not to be in love. These instructions read, in aggregate, as the description of a way of being in the world that is almost monastically stripped of the usual consolations and attachments that most people use to navigate their lives. They are not prescriptions for happiness in any conventional sense. They are prescriptions for freedom. Reading the Dokodo next to the Book of Five Rings reveals something important about the arc of Musashi's thinking across his lifetime. The Book of Five Rings is, at its core, a work about engagement, about how to be fully present in competition and conflict, about how to read situations and respond to them with precision and force. The Dokodo is, by contrast, a work about non-attachment, about how to be so free from wanting and fearing that nothing external can disturb the quality of your attention. Together, these two documents describe a complete philosophy, one that addresses both action and stillness, both engagement and withdrawal, as aspects of a single unified way of being. The Dokodo is also, when read carefully, a portrait of Musashi himself. Each of its 21 precepts reads like a hard-won lesson extracted from specific lived experience. The injunction not to hold on to resentment feels like a man who has spent decades releasing old grievances. The instruction not to be governed by desire for a comfortable life feels like a man describing the actual conditions under which he spent the majority of his adult years. The precept about accepting the world as it is rather than lamenting how it ought to be feels like a man who watched the world he grew up in dissolve and who found a way to keep walking anyway. It is not a theoretical document. It is a life distilled into 21 sentences by someone who had actually lived it all the way to the edge and who was now, 7 days from death, trying to pass on the essential thing before the light went out. Miyamoto Musashi died on the 19th day of the 5th month of 1645 in the cave of Reigando, less than 2 years after he had entered it to write. He had sensed his own death approaching with what his closest students described as complete equanimity. He had given away his possessions in the days before the end. He had distributed his manuscripts and his artworks. He had written the Dokodo. He had said what needed to be said. When death came, he reportedly sat up, straightened his clothing, placed one hand on his sword and one hand on his knee, and died in that position, upright. Whether those precise details are historically accurate or whether they have been refined and elevated by the reverence of those who followed, the image captures something true about the man as he has come down to us through the centuries. He died the way he had lived, deliberately, without performance, without panic, in a posture of complete readiness. He was around 61 years old. He had never been married, never established a household, never settled in one place for long. He had no biological children. He had, in a very real sense, given his whole life to a single pursuit, the pursuit of understanding what it means to do one thing with absolute mastery. In the centuries since his death, Miyamoto Musashi has become something that no living person can ever fully be. He has become a symbol. In Japan, his image appears in woodblock prints, novels, films, television dramas, manga, video games, and philosophical texts. The most celebrated novel ever written about him, Eiji Yoshikawa's Musashi, published in the 1930s, was one of the most widely read books in 20th century Japan and remains in print today around the world. The image of Musashi as a wild, unkempt genius drifting through a world of moral complexity, finding his path through violence and art and solitude, has a power that transcends its historical specificity. Outside Japan, the Book of Five Rings has been translated into dozens of languages and has found readers in contexts its author could never have imagined. In the 1980s, it was widely read by Western business executives trying to understand the principles behind Japanese commercial success. It has been studied by military strategists, by professional athletes, by competitive gamers, by negotiators and diplomats. Whatever one thinks of these applications, they testify to something real in the text itself. The principles Musashi articulated from that cave in 1645 are abstract enough to be genuinely transferable across domains, and specific enough to be actually useful rather than merely inspiring. But the legend also does something to the man that is worth being honest about. The real Musashi was complicated in ways that his legendary image tends to smooth over. He was capable of extreme violence that went beyond the formal rules of dueling. His deliberate lateness, his psychological manipulation of opponents before fights began, the episode with the Yoshioka school where he killed a teenager, these are not the acts of a serene philosopher warrior. They are the acts of a fiercely competitive and sometimes ruthless man who wanted to win and was willing to do almost anything to ensure that he did. Understanding him fully requires holding both things at once, the philosopher and the killer, the artist and the strategist, the man who wrote about non-attachment while being completely attached to the project of never losing. There is something about Musashi's life that speaks with particular force to the modern world, and it is not, perhaps, the thing that is most often emphasized. People tend to focus on his competitive invincibility, on the 60 undefeated duels, on the image of the lone warrior who was simply better than everyone else, and that is compelling. But what is more interesting, and more genuinely useful, is his relationship to the problem of mastery itself. Musashi spent his entire adult life engaged in the question of what it means to truly know something as opposed to merely being able to perform it. He was deeply suspicious of expertise that rested on reputation rather than understanding. He was contemptuous of systems that protected their methods rather than transmitting genuine principles. He believed that real mastery in any domain required the practitioner to go back constantly to first principles, to ask not what has worked before, but what actually works, and why, and under what conditions. This is not a medieval idea. This is a description of the scientific habit of mind applied to the domain of personal practice. He also understood something about the relationship between multiple disciplines that is only beginning to be appreciated in formal educational contexts. He was not an artist and a swordsman by accident or by dilettantism. He believed, and practiced his belief, that depth in one domain of mastery illuminates other domains, that the principles of timing and spacing and rhythm that govern a sword fight are the same principles, operating at a different scale, that govern the construction of a compelling painting, that the management of your own fear and attention in combat is the same internal challenge in a different key, that the management of your own fear and attention requires when you are trying to make something genuinely new in an artistic medium. In his own era and in ours, the most common response to difficulty is to seek safety in specialization, to go deeper and deeper into a narrowing range of known technique, to build walls around the familiar and defend them against the unfamiliar. Musashi spent his whole life doing the opposite. He went toward the unfamiliar. He sat with uncertainty. He picked up the brush after the sword, the chisel after the brush. He walked into caves and open fields and ambushes and the presence of acknowledged masters, and each time he tried to see what was actually there rather than what he expected or feared to find. That habit of mind, more than any particular technique or victory, is his real legacy. One of the most misunderstood dimensions of Musashi's thought is his relationship to the sword itself. In Western popular imagination, the image of the samurai sword has been so thoroughly romanticized that it tends to obscure what Musashi actually believed about weapons and their role in a warrior's development. He was not, contrary to the impression left by many retellings, a man who worshipped the sword or believed it possessed any mystical properties. He was, if anything, almost dismissive of the idea of the sword as a sacred object. He chose, famously, to fight many of his most important duels with wooden swords or with improvised weapons, the carved oar at Ganryujima being only the most celebrated example. He regarded the particular implement in the hand as far less important than the mind directing it. The wooden practice sword, the bakken, in the hands of someone who truly understood the principles of timing and distance and initiative, was, in his view, fully as deadly as a sharpened blade in the hands of someone who did not. He was making a point that could not be made more dramatically, a point about where the actual power in a contest resides. This attitude extended to his famous two-sword style. When Musashi advocated for learning to fight with both a long and short sword, he was not primarily making a technical argument about the mechanical advantages of having an additional weapon in the offhand. He was making a philosophical argument about the nature of readiness. A warrior, he argued, who has trained extensively only with the long sword has created a dependency. He has made himself a man who is fully capable only under a specific set of conditions, and any condition that removes those specific factors strips away much of his capability. The warrior who can fight equally well with any weapon or with no weapon at all has achieved a level of mastery that does not depend on external circumstance. The sword is a tool. What the sword reveals is the mind behind it. This idea became central to his later philosophy, and finds its fullest expression in the Go-Rin No-Shows Water chapter, where he writes about the importance of being able to use any weapon that comes to hand and of understanding your opponent's weapons so completely that you know their limitations as well as your own. The swordsman who only knows swords is a specialist. The warrior who understands the principles that govern all armed conflict, regardless of the specific implements involved, is something larger and more capable than a specialist. Musashi spent his life trying to become the latter, and it is this ambition toward a kind of universal competence grounded in deep principle that makes his work feel so surprisingly applicable to domains that have nothing to do with fighting at all. It is easy, when reading Musashi's philosophical writings, to forget that all of the extraordinary ideas in them were generated by a body, a physical organism that had to carry him through 60-plus years of extraordinary physical and psychological stress. The kind of lifestyle Musashi lived during his wandering decades, sleeping rough, eating irregularly, fighting repeatedly at the absolute limits of human speed and skill, would have destroyed many constitutions. That he survived it long enough to reach old age and produce his greatest written work is itself remarkable, and it was not an accident. Musashi was deeply attentive to the physical dimension of martial practice in ways that his philosophical reputation sometimes obscures. He wrote extensively in the Book of Five Rings about the management of the body in combat, about posture and breathing, and the alignment of physical structure in ways that neither waste energy nor create rigidity. He was ahead of his time in his understanding of the relationship between physical tension and mental rigidity, noting that a body that is unnecessarily tense cannot respond quickly to the unexpected, because the tension itself is a form of commitment to a particular position that has not yet been tested against reality. He also had very specific views about the management of the warrior's mind and body in the period immediately before combat. He wrote about the importance of not letting your heart rate be driven by external circumstances, about maintaining what he called a normal, everyday mind in situations that were anything but normal or everyday. This is again something that modern sports psychology has extensively researched and confirmed as a genuine performance factor. The athlete or competitor who can maintain their cognitive and physical composure under pressure performs consistently better than one whose physiology is hijacked by the stress response. Musashi was describing this phenomenon from direct personal experience across 60 separate life-or-death encounters, which gives his observations a kind of empirical weight that very few philosophers of any era can claim. In his final years in the cave, his body was failing him in ways he acknowledged frankly in his writings. The trembling in his hands, the declining vigor of his constitution, the approach of death as a physical reality rather than a philosophical abstraction, all of these are present in the texture of the Dokodo and in the passages of the Book of Five Rings, where he discusses mortality with a directness that is genuinely moving. He had spent his whole life pushing his body to its limits in the service of understanding. Now the body was showing him its own limit, and his response was to sit down in a cave and write as clearly and completely as he could before the opportunity was gone. The mind driving the brush was the same mind that had driven the sword. It was just driving something different now and toward a different kind of target. Near the end of his life, Musashi wrote something that has stayed with readers for nearly 4 centuries, not because it is dramatic or violent or even particularly surprising, but because of its quiet completeness. He wrote that he had, after a lifetime of practice and reflection, finally come to understand the way. He did not claim to have achieved perfection. He did not claim that there was nothing left to learn. He simply said that he understood the principles, that the understanding was now stable within him, and that it was time to pass it on and let go. There is something almost unbearably human in that formulation, in the image of a 60-year-old man in a cave, his hands trembling slightly from the illness that would kill him within months, writing down as clearly as he could the things he had spent his whole life trying to figure out. He was not writing for posterity in any grandiose sense. He was writing for Magonojo. He was writing for the students who would come after Magonojo. He was trying to shorten the road for whoever was willing to walk it. Miyamoto Musashi walked into that cave with nothing but a brush, some ink, and 60 years of accumulated understanding. He walked out of it in the only way that really matters, in the words he left behind, still teaching, still asking the only question he ever really cared about. Not how do I win, but how do I truly know? That question, asked with that kind of total commitment across a whole life and in the teeth of every kind of difficulty, is what makes him something more than a swordsman or a legend or a symbol. It is what makes him worth listening to, still, in the quiet hours of the night, when the world has finally gone to sleep and there is only you and the question and the long road ahead. There is a final image worth holding on to as you drift toward sleep tonight. Somewhere in Japan, in the mountains of Kumamoto, the cave of Reigando still exists. You can visit it. You can stand in the same darkness where Musashi sat, in the same silence, with the same stone walls around you. And if you stand there long enough, in that quiet, it is not hard to imagine the scratch of a brush on paper, the careful and deliberate formation of words by a man who knew he was running out of time and who chose, above all other possible uses of that time, to write down what he had learned, to leave something useful behind, to turn a life of extraordinary violence and extraordinary beauty into something that could be carried forward by strangers he would never meet, in a world he could never have imagined, across centuries he would never see. That is what Miyamoto Musashi did. And tonight, in whatever corner of the world you are lying in whatever quiet hour you have carved out for yourself, you are part of that carrying forward. Thank you for listening. Good night, and sleep well.